going to take you back into the mists of time to when the Sassanid dynasty ruled in Persia. Now, the Sassanid dynasty ruled between kind of the 3rd and 6th centuries AD. So that's how far back we go. And there was a king of the Sassanid dynasty. I have a feeling one of my legs is going to go in a minute. All right. And this king had 2 sons. Now, one was already a mature man. The other one was in the prime of his youth. And of course, when the king eventually died, the elder son became the king. His name was Shahryar. His younger brother was called Scheherazade. Now, when Shahryar ascended to the throne, right, he loved his younger brother so much that he thought, it's not fair that I'm the ruler and he has nothing, to do. We look at our own royal family, now that Charles has become king, all the lesser princelings are just loafing around with nothing to do, aren't they? Whatever it is, And for years and years and years, that's what Charles was doing while Elizabeth was there. He was like, will I ever get my chance? But in the meantime, let's talk to these trees or whatever. So he didn't want his brother ending up like Charles. So he decided he would give his younger brother a kingdom of his own. And he gave him a kingdom far away in Samarkand. In the Orient. This is a long way away. And they said their goodbyes, and the young Shah Zenan set off to his new kingdom in Samarkand. And by all accounts, Shahryar ruled his kingdom well, and Shah Zenan ruled his kingdom well. And this went on for 20 years. And in all that 20 years, they had never seen one another. And then Shahryar started thinking, it's 20 years since I've seen my little brother. I really would like to see him again. So he called his chief minister, his vizier, and he said to him, right, I want you to get everything prepared because I want to go on a visit to see my younger brother in Samarkand. And his chief minister said, that's not really a good idea because there's lots going on in the kingdom at the moment that you've got to deal with. It might be better if you sent an invitation to your brother to come here to visit you. And so that's what Shahryar did. And so he charged the vizier with getting everything prepared. And of course, this is not just a case of throwing a backpack on and just heading off out. You've got to get the big camel train and horses and gifts and gold and saddles with golden bits hanging off them. You've got to send all this up. He is a king after all. He's got to send these gifts to his brother. And then it took them 3 days to get it all together. And then the vizier headed off on a long journey to Samarkand. Now, as he travelled through the kingdom of Shahryar, every time he came to a big city, he was greeted with all the pomp and ceremony that the first minister of the king would expect. And of course, in those days, 3 days was the minimum time that you would spend somewhere. And there would be lots of feasting and dancing and singing, And then they would accompany you on a full day's ride on your journey before saying goodbye. So it took quite a while before the vizier eventually approached the city and the palace of Shah Zenan. And riders were sent ahead to inform him that his brother's vizier was close by. And so he sent out some people to greet them a full day's ride away, so that they were escorted into the city, and there was rose petals strewn all over the place and banners all over the city and bugles being blown and all the pomp and ceremony. And then the vizier came and he told Shah Zenan why he was there, that his elder brother wished to see him after 20 years. Scheherazade was delighted. Oh, yes, this would be fantastic to go and see my brother. Right? So, of course, he had to make all his preparations, and that took days. And eventually, he had everything ready. And, of course, they had to go through the 3 days of feasting and music and dancing and all that, which was customary. And then they got everything together, and they went outside of the city walls, and they set up camp, right, ready to start bright and early the next morning on their journey to go and meet the elder brother. And when he was in the camp that night, Scheherazade thought, oh no, I had a gift for my brother and I've left it behind in my chambers. Right? But the city will be locked up. Right? The gates will be closed. Right? And I don't want to disturb everybody by coming back in and making a big sign about it. But because he was the king of the city, he knew the secret ways in and out of the city. So he knew how he could get back into the city, and he thought, I'll just nip back in, get the present, right? And then back out again, and then into the tent, and then we'll be on the road in the morning. So he snuck back into the city, and he went into his chambers, and he got a bit of a surprise, because there, stretched out on the bed, was his wife, his beautiful wife. And stretched out beside her was a greasy cook from the kitchens, wrapped around his wife. And he thought, what? And he was so incensed, he just pulled out his scimitar and with one stroke cut both of them in two. And then he picked up the present for his brother, and he quietly left the city and back out, and then he spent the rest of the night in the tent, although he barely slept, thinking, my God, if that's what she was like when I was just camped outside, what would have been the goings on after I'd been gone for several weeks? So it was lucky that I got back in there and saw them. So bright and early the next morning, they broke camp and they started on the long journey towards the palace of Scheherazade. But as each day went on, Scheherazade just kept thinking about what his wife had done, and he couldn't believe this. And he was just preying on his mind, and he wasn't sleeping, and he wasn't eating, and he was losing weight, and his complexion was getting very sallow, and the vizier was getting very worried about him. And every time they arrived at a little watering hole, he would spend a bit longer there than he normally would, because he thought, okay, so I don't want to end up arriving back to tell Scheherazade that his son or his brother is dead from the journey. But eventually they made it all the way back to the city and the palace of Scheherazade. And Scheherazade rode out with his retinue to greet his brother. And of course, as soon as he saw his brother, he was shocked, looking at him, how tired and gaunt he looked. And he said, brother, are you okay? Like, you don't look well. And he said, no, it's just the journey. It's just the journey. I'm just a bit tired from the journey. I'll be fine. Right? And he brought him into the palace, and then they had a big feast. But he noticed that his younger brother wasn't eating very much at the feast. And he wasn't really engaged in the music and the dancing. Didn't seem to be really enjoying himself. His mind was elsewhere. And he asked again, are you all right, brother? And he said, no, it's okay. It's just the journey. It's just taxed me a bit. He said, I'll be fine. Just give me a few days. But the days turned into weeks, and still Scheherazade wasn't getting any better. Because all the time it was just preying on his mind how his wife had behaved. Well, one morning then Scheherazade came to his brother and he said, right, we're going to go out on a hunt. You really enjoyed hunting when we were younger. Why don't you join us on the hunt? That will perk you up. And he said, oh brother, he said, I don't think I could manage it. I really don't. I'm going to stay here in the palace and just relax. He said, by the time you come back from the hunt, I should be much better. I'll be in better spirits. And they were going off on the hunt for about 10 days. So he said, yeah, by the time you get back, I'll be right as rain. Everything will be fine. So Shahryar and the hunting party, headed off out. And Shah Zenan, who had his apartments, overlooked the beautiful pleasure gardens within the palace. And there was a little balcony outside. And the balcony was screened by lattice work, which had plants and flowers going. But he could still sit there and he could look out through the lattice work and look out onto the pleasure gardens. And whilst he was sitting there, he noticed a little gate in the wall opening. And then through the gate came his brother's wife, followed by about 20 of her handmaidens. And as they came into the pleasure gardens, he kind of moved himself back a bit into the shadows so he could observe them, but they couldn't see him. And in the center of the pleasure gardens, there was a big fountain, and they all made their way towards the fountain. And then he saw that all 20 handmaidens suddenly started to disrobe. And he was a bit shocked at first, until he realized they're not all maidens. Only 10 of them were female, the other 10 were male slaves. And they all started to get down to it, all around the fountain. And then his brother's wife went to a large tree and she called up, "Oh my Saeed, come to me." And again, this huge big slave, slobbering slave, came down from the tree and picked her up, and she wrapped her legs around him, and soon they were at it as well, in the pleasure gardens. And Shahzanan couldn't believe this. He was like, what is happening? And they were out there for hours. And then, when they were all finished, they all climbed into the fountain and they gave themselves a little foofing and washing and whatnot. And then they got dressed and they all disappeared out the little gate. Irish Catholics, is that what it is? Bit of a douching. Yeah.
I don't know any man that could last that long.
I didn't say what they were doing for several hours. You know, might have been doing a crossword, I don't know. Anyway.
Rosary.
Yeah. So they all disappeared off. And then Shahzanan sat there and he was like, this is incredible. All this time, I've been thinking, how could this happen to me? How could this happen to me, a king? How could my wife behave like this towards me, a king? And now I see that worse has happened to my brother, an even greater king. Maybe things aren't so bad after all. So he called a servant to bring in some food and some drink. And he thought, I've got an appetite now. And he started tucking into the food. And then he was taking all his meals. So by the time Shahryar came back from the hunt, he was a changed man. He came out to greet his brother. He put on weight. His complexion was better. And his eyes were bright. And he hugged his brother and welcomed him back. And his brother was amazed at the change in him. And he thought, wow, what's gone on here? So that evening when they were sat down having a meal together, he said, brother, I'm amazed at the change in you. What has brought about this change in you? And he goes, oh, please, brother, don't ask. He said, it was the journey, and now I'm over it, and I've got my appetite back now, But Shahryar wouldn't let it go. And he's gone, this seems like a miraculous recovery. What's going on here? You've got to tell me what's going on. And he goes, and he kept at him and at him and at him. And eventually, Scheherazade said, okay, look, I'll tell you the reason why I looked like I did when I arrived here, but please do not ask me to tell you why I've suddenly come out of that and I'm so much better. So Shahryar said, okay then, let's see how this goes. He said, yeah, tell me. So Scheherazade told him all about what had happened the night that he was leaving his palace in Samarkand and sneaking back in and finding his wife and cutting the two of them in half with his scimitar. And Shahryar couldn't believe this. He said, I'll tell you what, he said, I'm glad it wasn't me, he said, because if that was me, I wouldn't have just stopped with her. I'd have killed 1,000 women for what she did. And he said, brother, that's an amazing story. He said, but now that you've told me that, you must tell me why you've suddenly come out of that and things have changed. And he's gone, please, brother, please, please do not ask me. But Shahryar wouldn't let it go. And eventually, Scheherazade told him exactly what he had seen in the pleasure gardens. And at first, Shahryar couldn't believe this. His wife, no, that just couldn't be true. And he said, right, I'm not calling you a liar, but until I see this with my own eyes, I cannot take it as truth. So Scheherazade said, right, organise another hunt. We'll make a big show of leaving and going on the hunt, but we'll stop not very far away, out of sight, and then I'm sure, like myself, you know secret ways back into the city. And Shahryar said, yes, I do. He said, we'll come back in, we'll sneak back in, we'll go to my chambers, we'll go out onto the balcony, we'll hide behind the lattice work, and we'll observe. And that's what they did. And they hadn't been there very long when they noticed the gate opening in the wall. And out came Shahryar's wife, followed by the supposed 20 handmaidens, who all made their way to the centre of the pleasure gardens where the fountain was. And then they all stripped off, and Shahryar could see with his own eyes that 10 of them were maidens and 10 of them were male slaves. And soon they got down and dirty. And then he saw his own wife going over to a tree and calling up, oh, come to me, my Saeed. And then he saw this big fat slave slobbering coming down and taking his wife up in his arms and taking her over and stripping her off and getting down to it. And he just couldn't believe it. And even though he couldn't believe it, he still sat there for the 2 hours.
While they did a crossword.
Because his brother said, no, the best bit's to come yet when they all get in there and wash themselves. Right? And then they left. Right? And Shahryar was like, oh, brother, I cannot believe. I could hardly believe your story when you told me what had happened to you, but I cannot believe that this has happened in my own palace and that I've seen it with my own eyes. He said, right, we're going to leave now. We're going to leave the palace without anybody knowing we've been here. Right? But we're not going hunting. We're going to travel around the kingdom, right, to see if we can find anywhere in the kingdom a woman that can be trusted. And so they left and they headed off out into the desert. And they've been traveling for several days when eventually they came to the edge of a great sea. And they thought they would take a rest there, got off their horses, right? And they were relaxing in the sand when they looked out to sea and they saw a great disturbance out to sea. And they thought, what is that out there? And then they saw that something was moving towards the land, pushing a huge wave of water ahead of it. And as it was coming closer, they thought, oh, we don't want to be here when that arrives, whatever it is. Right? So they got rid of the horses, and the pair of them climbed up a tree and hid up in the tree. And as this great wave of water came closer and closer, they could see that it was a great jinn, a genie. And it was carrying on its head a box of some sort. And it came closer and closer and closer until eventually it came up onto the beach right in front of them. And then going down on its knees, it took the box from its head and placed it down and opened up the box and then took out a gilded cage and then opened 7 locks on the cage, and from inside it took out a beautiful woman. And then the genie lay down and said to the woman, I feel very tired after that journey. I'm just going to lie down and sleep for a while. And she said, yes, of course, my love, you do that. And the jinn lay out on the sand and she stroked his head until soon he was snoring. And the 2 brothers were up in the tree going, oh my God, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of this? And she turned around and looked, and she looked up and she saw the 2 of them. And she beckoned to them, come down, come down. And they were going, no, I'm coming down there. No, it's not happening, no. And she said, come down now or else I'm going to wake him up. Right? And then you'll be sorry. Right? So the 2 brothers gingerly climbed back down the tree. And they came out towards this young woman. And she said, right, I need the pair of you now to stroke me a strong stroke. I will leave you to interpret that whatever way you wish.
There's the cabbage again.
And they're like, what? What? No, not with him. No, that's not happening. And she said, yes, it is. If both of you don't stroke me a strong stroke right now, I'm waking him up. And you know what's going to happen then. And then the 2 brothers started arguing. What? I'm the eldest brother. I'm telling you, you do her first. No, you're the eldest brother. You should have first refusal. You go. And the parent went, no, you, please first. No. And she said, right, quit the arguing. Right? One of you better get to it now, and then the other get himself ready. So they had no choice. Both of them. Don't ask me who got sloppies. I don't know. Right? But both of them stroked her a strong stroke. Right? And then, afterwards, she reached into the gilded cage and she took out a bag, and she opened the bag and she took out from the bag this long string. And on the string there were loads and loads of rings, gold rings, like signet rings. And she said to him, do you know what this is? And they're like, no. And she goes, there's 570 rings on here. Huh? Rings from every man that has futtered to me. Don't ask me what a futtering is.
How are you spelling that?
Like buttering, but with a F. Okay? There might have been buttering as well, I don't know. But there's definitely futtering.
I thought it might be a PH, wasn't it?
Yes. These are the rings of every man that has futtered to me, right under the nose of this jinn, who stole me away from my husband on my wedding night before he had even taken my maidenhead. And he thinks that I am his alone. But no, jingle jangle, jingle jangle. What? This is the proof that I am not his alone. So now I want to add both of your rings onto the. So take them off. I'll wake them up. So they took the rings off and they got added onto the string. So there's now 576. And then she said, right, well, best you be off before he wakes up. So the 2 boys skedaddled off into the desert to look for their horses. And they eventually found them. And as they were riding away, they were both shocked and they were going, okay, Scheherazade, what happened to you? That was terrible. And then worse happened to me. But if this can happen to a mighty jinn, then no one is safe. So I think both of us should now make a pact. Huh? Nothing more to do with women, yeah? Except by our rules. And it was left to both of them to decide what their own rules would be. So they went back, they joined the hunting party, they came back to the palace of Shahryar. The first thing Shahryar did when he got back to the palace was he called his chief minister, his vizier, and he said, right, I want you to go and find my wife, find all her handmaidens, find all the male slaves, and there's another fellow up in the tree, and I want you to put them all to death. Well, obviously the vizier didn't question those kind of orders, because that's what he went and did. And then Shahryar and Shah Zenan said their goodbyes. Shah Zenan headed off to Samarkand, and he had made up his mind he was going to have nothing to do with women anymore, ever. And at first Shahryar felt the same. But he was still a man in the prime of his life. And he thought, why should I completely forgo the pleasures of women? Well, so he decided on a strategy. He was going to get married. He was going to get married in the evening. He was going to spend the night with his bride. He was going to take her maidenhead, and in the morning he was going to have her executed. And so that's what he did. Every single day. Every day. He married in the evening. After he was finished his work, whatever kings do, a new young bride would be brought before him. Right? The marriage ceremony would take place. He would take her to the bridal bed, right? Have his way with her, and in the morning he would leave the chamber, and the vizier would come in and take her away to be executed, have her head chopped off. Well, this went on for quite some time, and pretty soon there were no eligible young women left in the kingdom, and any families that did have eligible young women decided they better move kingdoms. Now, the vizier himself had 2 daughters, and you probably recognize the name of the elder daughter, Scheherazade. The younger daughter was called Dunyazad. Now, Scheherazade was a very intelligent young woman and very widely read, and she also liked to go down into the marketplace and listen to the storytellers. Because you know what attractive chaps they are, those storytellers. No. So she had accumulated a great many stories as well as a wealth of knowledge. And it came to the point where the vizier couldn't find an eligible bride for Shahryar. He said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? So Scheherazade came and said, Father, I think I've got the answer to your problem. And he goes, what's that, my daughter? And she said, why don't you marry me to the king? And he said, what? No, that's not happening. What? Put that out of your mind. It's just not happening. What? And she said, it's all right, Father. I have a plan. He said, I don't care if you've got a plan. It's just not happening. All right? So forget about it. All right? But she was very insistent. And she went on and on and on and on and on. Now, this is the point where the first of the stories appears. But I'm not going to tell it to you, because the story is told by the vizier to Scheherazade. And it's told as a cautionary tale, because the moral of the story is it's about a man and his wife. And the wife is not being very obedient, and she's being very nosy and being very insistent on her husband telling her things. And despite him saying, no, you don't need to know, she keeps. But at the end of it, she learns her lesson and she becomes a good and obedient wife once again. Now, the vizier only tells Scheherazade this so that she would learn from the story and she would become a good and obedient daughter. But it didn't bloody work. And she said, well, despite that, I still want you to arrange for me to be married to Scheherazade. Well, in the end, she wore him down. Right? And he thought, maybe after all my years of faithful service, that, Scheherazade won't kill my daughter. Right? So he went to the king and he said, Your Majesty, there's a bit of an issue about finding suitable bride for you for tonight. But I have 2 daughters. But my elder daughter, Scheherazade, is willing to be your bride for tonight. And the king said, all right, well, that's fine, but don't expect any special favours. In the morning, I will still expect you to execute her. Right? And the vizier went back and he told Scheherazade, and she said, don't worry, everything will be fine. Anyway, that evening, she was all bathed and dressed and powdered and perfumed, and she was brought to Scheherazade. The marriage ceremony took place, and then she was brought into the bridal chamber, and they were on the marriage bed. A little bit of foreplay was going on, a bit of heavy petting going on. And Scheherazade was all ready to do the deed when Scheherazade started weeping. And he thought, what's going on? What's the matter? I'm the king. Don't you want to be taken by the king? And she said, yes, of course I do. But I was just thinking, this is my last night on earth, and I was just wondering, I would like to spend, this last night also with my sister, Dunyazad. So this is how they roll, or this is how they rolled back then, because he didn't even bat an eyelid. He said, no problem, and he sent the servant off to get Dunyazad, who was brought in and was sat on a divan or a couch or something at the end of the bed, and then Scheherazade said she was happy. So then he was able to take her maidenhead with her sister just stretched out there. But the plan had been kind of agreed beforehand with Scheherazade and Dunyazad. I think we spoke last month or the month before about this old practice of not sleeping all the way through the night. Sleeping for 4 hours and then waking for 2 hours and then sleeping again. And this is obviously how they did it at the time, because Scheherazade had made this plan with Dunyazad that after they'd fallen asleep first, when they awoke at midnight, Dunyazad should say, oh sister, as it's your last night, would you please tell me one of those stories you used to tell me when I was younger? And so this is exactly what Dunyazad did when they all awoke at midnight. And Scheherazade said, well, I would love to, sister of mine, if the king will allow. Well, the king was awake and he thought, oh, why not? Wouldn't mind hearing a story, that'd be nice. So Scheherazade began to tell a story. And she said, long ago, there lived a merchant in a faraway city. And this merchant was quite wealthy. He did lots of business. He did lots of travelling, trading goods here and there. Right? A lot of it was done on credit. So at certain times of the year, he would have to go travelling to collect the monies that were owed to him. And then once he got that money, he would have to go travelling again to pay the money that he owed to others. Well, on one of his travels, he'd been riding for most of the day and he was quite tired and the sun was quite high, he was getting hot, and found himself a little shady grove and tied up his horse, and then he sat down in the shade and he took from his saddlebag some bread and some dates, right, and some water, and he was eating the bread, and eating the dates, and as he took the stones out, he was flinging them into the trees. And this had been going on for a while. When suddenly there was a great noise. And a mighty djinn appeared. They're all over the place, these djinns. A mighty djinn appeared with sword in hand.
And a tonic in the other.
Quick. You've been sitting there waiting for that, haven't you? After I did the last one, she goes, if he does another one of them gins, I'm coming in with the tonic gag. And he had the sword in hand. And he said, prepare to meet thy death, for thou hast slain my son. And the merchant was going, what do you mean, hang on, what? I don't even know your son. What do you mean I've slain him? I think there's been some mistake. And he said, no, you've been here eating dates and throwing the stones into the trees. Well, one of those stones hit my son in the chest and killed him. Stone dead. See? You're not the only one. Everyone's a critic, eh? And the merchant was going, well, I'm sorry, there was a complete accident. I didn't mean to kill your son. Please, forgive me. And the djinn said, no, I cannot forgive you. Prepare to die. And he lifted up the sword and he was about to smote him in twain or something like that. And he said, wait. He said, I have a family and I have people that I owe money to. He said, can you give me some time to sort out all my affairs? Right? I would hate to die, and there was people out there that I owed money to. So I'd like some time to go back. And he said, and then I promise I will come back here. I will come back here in a year and a day, having sorted everything out, and then I will accept your punishment. So the djinn accepted this, and he said, okay, back here, a year and a day. And so the merchant got on his horse and headed off home. He told his family what had happened. He made sure he went around and sorted out all his affairs, that there was nobody that he owed money to. He sorted out everything so his family was taken care of. And pretty soon the year and a day was up. He got back on his horse and he rode back to that same shady grove, and he tied up his horse and he sat trembling, waiting for the djinn to appear. And then he heard a noise in the trees and he thought, oh, this is it. But no, it was an old man. Came into the grove and he was leading a gazelle. And he said, hello. He said, hello. And the old man said, what brings you to this place? And he said, oh, it's a long story. And he goes, really? Well, we've got time, you can tell me. So he tied up the gazelle and he sat down, and the merchant told him what had happened a year and a day before about throwing the date stones and all. Going, oh, that's terrible. Oh, and the djinn is coming here today. Yeah. Ooh. Right. Well, I'm a bit scared myself. I said, but I think I'll hang around and just see what happens. So the pair of them were sitting there, and then they heard a noise. They said, oh, this is it. This is the djinn coming. No. So another old man came, and he was leading two dogs. And he said, hello. And they said, hello. And he said, well, what are you doing sitting here? And they said, well, it's a bit of a long story. And he said, well, I've got some time. So he tied up the dogs and sat down, and he told them all that story again. What? And he goes, whoa, that's interesting. What? And the djinn's coming here today to kill you? Yeah. Right. He said, oh, I'm a bit scared myself. He said, but I fancy hanging around to see what happens. So now the three of them. Hello, come in. Come join us. So now the three of them are sitting there. And they're three of them are sitting there and they're waiting for the djinn to come. Right? And then there's a bit of a noise and they think, oh, this is it. Right? But now it's another old man. And he comes in and he's leading a mule. And he goes, hello. And hello. He said, what are you doing here? It's a bit of a long story. He said, well, I've got some time. So he tied up the mule and he sat down and they told him the story again. And he goes, whoa, he said, well, I'm a bit scared that Jin is coming here, but I fancy hanging around to see what happens. So they're all sitting there waiting, and next minute there's a bit of a noise. And it's the Jin! And he comes out, he has his sword out, and he goes, right, you! It's time to die! And the old man goes, right, yeah, okay, I'm ready. Right, the merchant says, I'm ready. And he kneels down, right, and the Jin is about to strike his head off, when the first old man says, hang on a second, he said, I was just wondering, he said, almighty Jin, if I was to tell you a story that, you know, you thought was like a really amazing, like one of the best stories you'd ever heard, would you give me a third of that man's life? And the Jinn thought, well, yeah, if it's a really good story. I said, right, said the old man. I said, see this gazelle here? And the Jinn said, yes. So, that's actually the daughter of my father's brother. All right. Yes. And actually, many years ago, I married her. Really? Yeah, and we had 30 years together, happily married together. Wow. But we never had any children. Wow. So he said, so I took a concubine. And then with the concubine, we had a son together. Beautiful boy. And as the boy grew up, he grew strong and tall and handsome. And when he was about 15, I had to go off on some business. And so I said goodbye to my wife and the concubine and my son, and I headed off to go and do the business. But what I didn't know was my wife had been studying the art of necromancy and magic. And while I was away, she turned the concubine into a heifer and turned my son into a calf, and then handed him to the herdsman to put him with the rest of the herd to look after. So when I came back, I was greeted by my wife, and I said, so where's my son and his mother? And she said, oh, bad news. Your son's mother died, and then your son ran away and nobody knows where he is. I go, oh. I said, I was so saddened by that. What? Well, what could I do? Well, not long after that, there was a feast day. And my wife said to me, for this feast day, we need to kill a nice good heifer to have for the feast. So she said, I know just the one. So she called the herdsman and she told him which one to pick out. And the herdsman led in the heifer, which was actually his son's mother, transformed. And he sharpened up the knife and he went over and he was about to cut the heifer's throat, but the heifer started fluttering its eyes at it. And he couldn't bring himself to kill the heifer. And he said, oh no, I can't do it. And his wife was going, yes, you must do it. It's a feast day. It's a very special day. You've got to kill that heifer. And he went over again and he goes, oh, I can't do it. And his wife said, it's got to be killed. And he said, well, I can't do it. The herdsman will have to do it. Right? So the herdsman came and cut the heifer's throat. Right? And then skinned the heifer. But all it was just a big bag of bones. There was no meat on it. Right? And he said, well, what are we going to do now? And his wife said, I know. We'll have to have a nice big fat calf instead. And she goes, I know just the one. So she sent the herdsman off to get the calf. And the calf was led in. But as it was brought in, it broke away from the herdsman and it ran up to the man and started nuzzling against him. And Mom's going, I can't kill it, I can't kill it. And his wife said, you have to kill it. He said, I don't think I can. And she said, you must. And if you can't kill it, you're not a man, and I don't know why I'm even married to you. So he thought, okay, I better do it. So he took the knife and he went over to the calf and he put the knife against its throat. And then Scheherazade realised that the sun was just coming up. And she said, I'm sorry, my dear sister, but the sun's coming up. I must meet my fate. I can't finish the story. Well, of course, the king was lying in the bed. Go. But he wanted to hear the end of the story. And she said, we must say our goodbyes now, because we must leave one another forever. And they hugged. And the king got up and he left the chambers, and waiting outside was the vizier with his daughter's shroud all ready for her to be executed. But the king just walked straight past him and walked on and got on and did all his kingly duties and signed his papers and put his royal seal to things and whatnot. And all day long the vizier was waiting for the order to execute Scheherazade. But it never came. And then that evening he was waiting outside the chambers, and the king came and disappeared into his chambers and closed the door. And then once they got into the chambers, he got into the bed with Scheherazade, and they toyed with one another once again. And then when they awoke at midnight, he wanted to hear the end of the story. And of course she told him the end of the story. And then she started another one. But she didn't quite get to the end of that before the sun came up again the next morning. So the next day he had to leave and come back. Right? And this continued for 1,000 nights and 1 night, and 2 children, until eventually the day came, or the night came, where she said, my husband, I'm so sorry, but I've run out of stories, so now I must meet my fate. But by that time Shahryar had fallen completely head over heels in love with Scheherazade, right? And he decided he wasn't going to go down that road. And so they spent the rest of their lives together in happiness. Well, thank you. Are you off, my friend?
Yep.